One second. There we are. Let me bring you in. There you are. I'm joined with Piers Robinson. He's co-director of the Organization of Propaganda Studies. And welcome to the show, man. How you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing well. Good to see you, Jamal.
Oh, good to see you, man. The reason why I asked you on is because propaganda studies is a really good subject for today. And it goes on so many levels in regards to the Syrian conflict, the civil war, the way we're doing now, where we're having these interviews, where they're doing these softball interviews of Jelani, like he's just a regular guy. He's just, he just went through a phase of chopping off heads. That's all. That's all it was. He's reformed now. So he's diversity-friendly terrorist that is now taken over. He's going to be patient and tolerant of the local population of minorities. It's just astonishing to me the way they flip on a dime. The man has a $10 million bounty by the US government. It's not like the US government didn't know where he was as he was taking over Syria. They effectively allowed it and then gave this kind of softball interview in order to moderate his appearance. Give me a take on this. And let me start off at the beginning of it, first and foremost. Your take on everything that's happened over the last 2 weeks and the speed and rapidity at which has happened.
Well, I think the situation now in Syria needs to be placed into a slightly broader contemporary historical context. Okay. We know very well now that regime change wars were being planned prior to 9/11, immediately after 9/11. And I mean, I work now for the International Center for 9/11 Justice, and my opinion as an academic is that the evidence is very clear that that was a manufactured war trigger or a false flag event in order to start major wars in the international system. And we knew
we totally disagree with that, but go ahead.
Sure, that's fine. That you're completely entitled to your opinion.
Yeah.
What we know from the Chilcot Report documents, which was the British inquiry into the Iraq War in 2003. We know that Tony Blair and George Bush were discussing multiple regime change wars within weeks of 9/11. We know that insiders have spoken about planning prior to 9/11. Wesley Clark famously in 2006 said that the goal was 7 countries in 5 years. Syria and Iran were on that list. And obviously, the kickoff wars at the beginning of the global war on terror was Afghanistan and Iraq. They obviously used deception, particularly in the case of Iraq, claiming that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, creating a link supposedly with the alleged allegations against Al-Qaeda and 9/11 in order to enable that war, that invasion. Segue through to the Arab Spring, as in inverted commas, as it's described. You then had the successful overthrow of the Libyan government. And then in 2011, you had the start of what's, I think, accurately characterized as the dirty war in Syria, which was a covert attempt to overthrow the Syrian government. And it's quite well known now, Operation Timber Sycamore, which was a joint CIA-Saudi operation, fueling extremist groups, Salafist extremist groups, linked to Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra Front, etc., all for the purpose of trying to overthrow the Syrian government. And what we have in the last week, 2 weeks, really, is the end point that the achievement of those plans, which have been in place for well over 20 years in order to overthrow the Syrian government, after years of bloodshed in the country, huge loss of life. And most of this, and this gets to your point about propaganda, most of this has been primarily sold to Western publics, or in other words, the propaganda campaign underpinning it has involved systematic attempts to demonize the Syrian government, demonize Assad, to whitewash the groups that we're supporting, as you just described, in relation to Jelani and HTS, who've effectively taken over at the moment in Syria, making them appear to be democratic, desiring, tolerant groups, maintaining the narrative that the Assad government is guilty of torture and guilty, of course, of using chemical weapons against its own population. And certainly from my own research, which I've been involved in, and I've obviously been involved in the OPCW, which is the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and the controversy over one of those alleged attacks in Douma in 2018, where ultimately two of the inspectors involved with that investigation basically blew the whistle that it was being manipulated in order to point the finger at the Syrian government. So, and I've studied other of these alleged events in Syria, Ghouta 2013, for example, and the evidence is very clear that these are false flags, or they are, in other words, staged events. Not to say that people aren't being killed, because certainly in the case of Douma, people were killed, but it's not because the Syrian government was carrying out chemical weapons attacks on its population. But that narrative has been built and pumped out across Western mainstream media for many, many years. And then again, the representation of the Assad government as a source of pure evil in the country. And that has enabled this to occur. And again, going back to the point about the regime change wars, we know who was behind the regime change wars. Project for a New American Century, neoconservative blocs within the US. One might broaden that out to the American national security state or the deep state, driving these wars as a matter of maintaining Western power in the international system. That was the goal of these wars. And that's exactly what we see playing out now. These wars are geopolitical wars fought, driven by the Western war machine, if you want to call it that, in the context where the international system is changing rapidly. China, Russia, India, BRICS, the global south. And this is a militaristic roll of the dice by the West, which unfortunately now has just carried on and on. People such as myself realized back in 2003 that the Iraq war was some kind of a deception. I subsequently established it was a deception over WMD. Syria, from my own research, looking at the propaganda associated with Syria, have come to understand that that's a deception as well. All of these conflicts have been driven through deceptive propaganda. And the goal is to strengthen Western geopolitical interests in the Middle East.
Piers,
And
just to back you up real quick, I want to back up something that you said.
Sure.
So the Syrian chemical weapons, the OPCW thing was a really big deal, because I think that set the consciousness of America on this notion that Assad is a brutal dictator that is gassing his own people. And one of the things that Seymour Hersh pointed out in his piece, they wouldn't even publish it here in the United States. They published it, I believe, in the London Book Review. And it pointed out that this more likely than not came through Turkey, not Syria. It wasn't even the same kind of product that was used. Like the sarin gas that was being moved through was coming through Turkey, wasn't necessarily a product from Syria itself, which called into question whether or not Syria was responsible at all. The OPCW report pointed out that they had to change the report. And I'll let you go into that part. This notion that the OPCW comes out with an initial report, and then come to find out some of the scientists who were there said that they were pushed, they were forced, or either the report was taken from them and changed of various people who weren't on the ground in order to even make that assessment. Give me your take on that, on what went on with that. Explain that to the American public, because that was a big deal. That was one of the big ticket items in the public consciousness.
Sure. The example you put up there was the Ghouta 2013 attack. Which was surrounding the infamous Obama administration's red line. If Assad crosses this red line, we will intervene, etc. That's a separate controversy from the OPCW in relation to Douma in 2018.
Oh, that's right. That was chlorine.
But both, I mean, both are connected. I mean, there are some very interesting things to say about Ghouta in 2013, and the most interesting one in terms of work that I've been doing and also engaging with the author of the UN investigation, A.K. Selstrom, is the fact that there's a measurement error on one of the rocket trajectories, and it's a measurement error. And this is based upon work done by Michael Cobbs and Adam Larson. The measurement error allowed basically the finger to be pointed at the Syrian government. And it's an error. So it's a demonstrable error. They're unable to, AK Selstrom is unable to give a clear response to that. So there was clearly a problem with that finger being pointed at the Syrian government with Ghouta 2013. And as you rightly documented there, Seymour Hersh talked about his intelligence or his contacts were saying that this looked like it was opposition groups who were obtaining these materials via Turkey. And I think that's part of that story. What happened in Douma in 2018 was initially the Americans said that there was a sarin, a nerve agent attack. And then they started to say, well, it's a chlorine attack, that this large number of civilians had been killed, 43 civilians in a chlorine attack in Douma, in a suburb of Damascus. And what happened is when, to get to the point you raised about the OPCW team, when the inspectors got in on the ground, they did their work, they came back, and they wrote up an initial report. And one of the problems they hit upon straight away was that there was no evidence of the nerve agent was ever found. And they were expecting this because the Americans had claimed this originally. But then this didn't really make a lot of sense because 43 people had died in a building. And you expect a nerve agent to be able to cause people to fall dead on the spot. But you don't expect chlorine gas to cause 43 people just to drop dead on the spot because people run away from chlorine. And what happened was the inspectors went to NATO toxicologists and showed them the witness testimony and the images. And the answer was very clear. These people weren't killed by chlorine. And that information was in the original report. And it was essentially, it was supposed to be published. And then at the last minute, without telling the Douma team, the inspectors who went, and without telling the lead inspector who'd written the report, Brendan Whelan, somebody switched a report and removed all of his information and essentially created a spun report which suggested that chlorine gas had been used to all intents and purposes. And that was the start of the controversy, at least internally within the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, that the investigation was being controlled. It was being manipulated in order to get evidence out of the reports which suggest that this might be a staged event, or that there wasn't really solid evidence at all of the attack that was being claimed. This was all basically pushed out. And then when the final report did come out, two of the most experienced scientists within the OPCW took a stand again, internally at least, and said, look, we need to have a conversation with the Director General. Something has gone terribly wrong with this investigation. And there are multiple problems with this final report which has come out, not least of which the NATO toxicologists who said that these civilians were not killed by chlorine gas is gone, or it hasn't been properly resolved. And they were simply stonewalled. They were blocked. They were not allowed to speak to the Director General. They were shut down. And then subsequent to that, material was leaked by WikiLeaks, which documented what had been going on within the organization. Effectively, the testimony of two of the scientists came out into the public domain. There were UN Security Council meetings. But all the way through, the OPCW refused to allow the inspection team to come back together again in order to, can we just see where this has gone wrong? And of course, the Americans and the Brits and the French were in the background of all of this. And, you know, you've got, for example, when one report was issued by the OPCW, after there'd been a big argument within the team saying, look, you've tried to put out a fabricated report, essentially a manipulated report. We've caught you and stopped you from doing that. They then had a visit from 3 American officials. They weren't quite clear who they were, State Department, not very clear, who basically ran through a set of slides and PowerPoint bullet points and said, yeah, they were killed by chlorine gas and it was Assad who did it, without providing any sort of clear evidence to the inspectors. But you can imagine the dynamic that created for the OPCW team. You've got 3 officials from a states party, from the US, coming in, telling you what happened. It's clearly going to sort of be a powerful signal to the inspectors that this is the expected result. And this is what America expects from the result. And so that's the story of the Douma alleged attack. And it's effectively, you know, after all of these alleged incidents and all of these investigations, you finally had one where clearly some people within the OPCW thought, well, this is getting beyond a joke, that there is a clear manipulation going on. We need to try and sort of stand up for the truth and so on. And they had to be stonewalled after that and so on. And of course, I work now with Jose Bastani, who's the first Director General of the OPCW, along with Hans von Sponeck and Professor Richard Falk, representing the issues raised by the scientists. But Duma is the entry into, or it's the crack in the dam, which allows you to understand that actually all of these investigations have been manipulated. And when you go back and look at previous alleged attacks, it doesn't take very long to start finding the same problems. They're relying upon the White Helmets, a group which is aligned in the country with Western interests, who are supplying the information about the alleged attack and so on. And this is how the narrative has been built and maintained on pointing the finger at the Syrian government. It's a strategic deception, and it's a strategic deception conducted by Western proxies in the country, working with people who effectively have penetrated the OPCW in order to maintain that narrative. Yeah. Very similar to what we saw in a way with Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction.
Iraq,
manipulation, but here you got manipulation going on in the OPCW, and that's the truth of it. And it's Ghouta is, when you look closely at Ghouta, the similar problems arise. All of the other alleged attacks. But it requires somebody to actually take the time and look through the reports, and then you can see that they're flawed. But of course, the mainstream media don't. They just take the headlines and then put it out. And
how do they, like, the expectation is that media, because media just reports. That's all they do. A government official said so-and-so, and the media just reports it. And I remember when this first came out, I believe it was Aramite was really hitting on this, basically pointing out, wait a minute, this looks dodgy. This doesn't look like what they say it is. And the media just ignored it. I mean, I remember they had 2 OPCW officials, as you pointed out, that came out vocally saying, this is not the right report. And the media just ignored it. Like, it's amazing to me in the way
and did a little bit more. They also just smeared.
Right.
So this is what happened to Seymour Hersh when he reported on Ghouta in 2013. Yes, that was the end of his access, I understand it, to mainstream US media. He was smeared as a conspiracy theorist or as an Assad apologist. And you get attacked. And that's happened to me. It's happened also to the OPCW inspectors. The media also engages in smearing and attacking you to try and shut you up. This is don't touch this issue because we'll make your life hell.
Well,
and so it's not just silence, it's also quite active, I think, in terms of trying to suppress the truth.
Do you think that, like, what do you think the connection is? That media has certain government sources that they don't want to lose access to? Do you think they are running with just the government line? Like, the government says this, so this is what we're going with. I mean, the fact that the New York Times has that report, the $1 billion CIA regime change war, basically Obama was trying to overthrow the Syrian government. It was spending like $1 billion to do it. Okay, did the media know that beforehand? When Tulsi Gabbard goes on to CNN and tells Jake Tapper, Jake, we're trying to overthrow the government. Jake, we're paying these people to do this. And Jake Tapper's like, well, the government said they're not doing that. Like, why does he reflexively say that when we can look back in the past and see that the government has overthrown other governments? Like, it's amazing to me that it's like the disconnect is always there. They always know about it 20 years into the future, but in the moment, they always miss it. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I mean, in the field of political communication studies, it's very well documented, and of course, Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's propaganda model and that reflected a wider literature, explained how journalists in mainstream media, partly they're very reliant upon sources, as you say, and official sources, and they defer to those official sources. But there are also essentially corporate interests for mainstream media, and those often overlap with government interests, especially in the context of foreign policy. And that creates a situation where if a journalist is going to go and cover a really controversial issue, they'll start to have quite a hard time. There'll be pushback from the government, there'll potentially be pushback from their editors, and even then higher up in the corporation. And because that is a hard reality, actually journalists internalize what works and what doesn't work. I think so. I think that kind of propaganda model of the mass media is well established, and it explains a lot of what we see. There's also a lot of people in the in the mass media who are almost undoubtedly connected to the intelligence services. As a church committee in the 70s, identified this quite clearly, the number of CIA-connected journalists there were in the American mainstream media. So you have an element of that going on. I've certainly had some experience of that over time. But these factors all work together to create a situation where journalists are just very unwilling to rock the boat, especially when it comes to foreign policy, and especially when it comes to war. Is another thing, so wars create and crisis situations create a situation where journalists, their patriotism can even kick in. So they don't want to question the Syria attacks, in the alleged counter attacks in Syria, because they'll be accused of being pro-Russian and so on. Just kind of implicating that you're some kind of traitor because you're raising these questions and so on. And all of these forces work together and create a very disciplined group of journalists. And so they don't even think to ask. My sense in recent years, this has just got even worse. I think that, as more and more people have kind of like drifted away from the mainstream media because they don't trust what they're being told, there's almost been this sort of doubling down in the mainstream media but we have been telling them the truth, and it is the governments who are telling us the truth. And boy, we're going to make sure that we stick to this. And that's what they're doing. And it seems to become even worse. So, I mean, I think Cy Hirsch said this, that there was a time when there was some tolerance for dissent. And of course, John Pilger, that passed away last year, the Australian war journalist, said that, he was a regular in the Guardian newspaper up until about 2015. And he said by that point, he was pretty much being frozen out. And so I think these kind of pressures on journalists have become worse and worse. And it's probably because the geopolitical world that we're moving into, the 9/11 and the global war on terror and the conflict now against Russia and the Ukraine, potentially China, potentially war now of Iran, now that Syria has fallen. All of these create a broader environment where journalists, I think, are just very, very scared. Not that justifies what they're doing, because they should be committed to the truth. But you've got a mortgage to pay, you've got kids to feed. And so you're thinking, okay, I'll go for a controversial issue, which is kind of like an acceptable controversy, one that sort of, either Republicans or if not the Democrats are pushing and so on. And I'll get caught up in that controversy and reporting both sides, or maybe take a side. But I won't go outside of that sphere into what Daniel Halland, a political communication theorist, described as a sphere of deviance, and question things more fundamentally. And that's what we've got now. And I think the sphere of legitimate controversy, where journalists feel they can say controversial things, is shrunk. And the sphere of deviance is really very, very big. And I think that explains a lot of what we see. And then the final thing is propaganda. Governments engage in a lot of propaganda, and Western governments are very good at it. They put huge resources into it. And so that, I think, is the final sort of layer to this, which if journalists aren't aware that they're being subjected to organized propaganda campaigns, as has been the case in Syria, if they think that the OPCW is telling us the truth, if they think that the white helmets are telling us the truth because they think the white helmets are independent when they're not, then, that's what they think the truth is, and so on. So
that's so wild to me. I mean, it's like you can look back into the past and see the lies that governments use in order to get from point A to point B, and yet in the moment, it's never the case. And I agree with you. Do you think that the reason why it's getting more narrow, meaning they seem to be more recalcitrant, more reflexive in regards to going with the government line, is because from the geopolitical standpoint, the West is under pressure? I mean, if you're talking about, for example, like the states, what is the word I'm looking for? The multipolarity, for example. From their point of view, well, multipolarity by definition is a direct contrast to a hegemon. We want to be a hegemon. And from the standpoint of the West, they could look like, especially from the standpoint of Western media, to be more aggressive, pushing back against it, especially now that you have social media that kind of diversifies the way that people can consume media. So the moment that something happens abroad, I can see it immediately. whereas beforehand, the only point of view that was given was from mainstream media in and of itself. Do you think this kind of global Cold War, unacknowledged as it is the cause of that? I mean, I'm beginning to think that there's more constraints on the media than we're aware of, just because of the way that they report stories. I mean, the Jelani thing, all of a sudden, just came out the blue. That all of a sudden he's a moderate. Like, who gives that order to say, yeah, this guy's now a moderate? Go and do that story.
Well, it's the propaganda campaign. It's we need to package and sell this guy a little bit like Zelensky in Ukraine.
Right.
Package this guy as a moderate, democracy-loving, human rights-loving individual, and so on. We've got to market this person to the Western publics and so on. We've got to demonize the enemy. And that's where that's coming from the propaganda drives, but it's getting worse, as you say, because the geopolitical realities of the world are a huge challenge to the West. The Western Empire, the West has dominated for hundreds of years in the international system. The US has dominated the post-World War II political environment, and that is changing. You see it changing. Obviously, we're effectively almost in a direct war with Russia over Ukraine. Losing that war, of course, people will say, but we've won in Syria now. But as you said a bit earlier on, we've been here before. We've seen what happened in Libya. We've seen what happened in Iraq. We've seen what happened in Afghanistan. And here we are doing the same thing again. But all of this is, the shifts in the distribution of power in the international system, the decline of the West. Now, the Western power centers and the permanent security states are pushing as hard as they possibly can to double down and try to shore up our position, which is my point about the global war on terror and 9/11. This is part of trying to get to this sort of, can we keep the West as the dominant hegemon in the international system? And I think it's a losing, apart from the morality of it, it's a losing battle in the long term. And it's going to lead, obviously, one of the fears that we could lead to a major war in the international system, or it could just lead to a lot of bloodshed, as we're seeing and continue to see, perhaps a war against Iran with more countless lives lost. Yeah. A lot of bloodshed before finally the reality seeps in or sinks into enough people within the Western elite. Because I don't think it's the public so much. The publics don't want war. Most people don't want war and so on. They want to be left to get on with their lives. But it's the war machine, the permanent war machine. If at some point, the reality sinks in that this strategy is bad for us, it's bad for the West, or it can't succeed, then the change might start to emerge, and we'll see an end to this. At the moment, I think, although the Syrian government has been removed now, we have to wait and see how that translates within the region in terms of distribution of power. At the moment, it looks like a shift to the West, and obviously Israel is exploiting it. It's already moved tanks into parts of Syria, but this is not clear how this is going to play out at the moment. In the Ukraine, it's certainly the case that Russia has demonstrated that it can take the territory that it wants to take. The Urashnik missile, it has demonstrated to the West, the hypersonic missile, that there's that military capability which the West has to take seriously, that the West cannot act as the world's hegemon in a world where these military changes have occurred, but also more fundamentally, where the economics of the world are changing. Right. The BRICS, global South, these emerging economies which are hungry for growth and to develop and so on. And they have served our interests for a long time. The Western Empire has done very well. Western imperialism, hundreds of years. But I think that time in the world is coming to an end for these structural reasons I described. But the elites aren't seeing that yet, and they're just pushing as hard as they can, partly because they're at the top of the power structure and they benefit the most from the arms industry and so on. But I think for Western publics, we have a broken financial system. There's a lot of dissent on the streets. There's a lot of dissent here in Germany in relation to Ukraine, for example. And I think, as the wars persist and so on, I think that kind of dissent and disengagement from governments will just grow and grow. So I don't see this going on forever, but it's been going on for a long time, and it can persist for quite some time to come. But I think the writing is on the wall. We have to change path and away from, we've got to be on top of the world, be the dominant player, and actually start to learn to work with other power centers in a more equal way. Sorry.
Not take this hubristic position every time you're dealing with another country that they're going to be offended by. You're in Germany. That's fascinating. I want to come back to the Germany thing for a moment, because Europe is astonishing to me. Like what they're doing to Romania, or for that matter, even what they're doing to Georgia right now, is mind blowing. And it's almost as if they've gone with this notion that in order to be a democracy, you have to be aligned with the EU or the West broadly. And if you take any dissension from that, then by definition, you're not a democracy. That is an astonishing concept, because what it allows is effectively governments that are sovereign governments can be put under this kind of Maidan 2.0 or 3.0 pressure. They effectively blew off the the Romanian election because of TikTok videos that they're saying influence the public. Now, they did that in the way, but in the US also, saying that Russia spent money, or what was it, Internet Research Organization?
Yes, the first Trump. Yeah,
that was a private company just trying to maximize profit, and they're trying to say, well, the $1 billion that Hillary Clinton spent was clearly outweighed by the $50,000 that were spent on ads, half of which took place after the election. It's just outrageous, and they're doing the same thing again. Before I get to that, the other element I would argue, and I want to get your take on, of what is taking place in regards to the diversification of media, using social media, where people can get news and information from other sources that are not necessarily filtered through the way the mainstream media gives it. You also made this other point that the majority of people at this point have started to get very skeptical of the information that media is giving them, hence going to other news sources. Censorship has to be the other side of propaganda. It has to be. Because what they've decided, John Kerry came out, said the First Amendment is a problem. We have to do something about it. Hillary Clinton said we need to start locking up people who are saying things that Hillary Clinton don't necessarily like them to say, despite the fact that Hillary Clinton is one of the biggest purveyors of misinformation. Kamala Harris was going to go after Twitter. And even after the election of Donald Trump, what many Democrats heard was, people were getting information from sources that we don't like, so we need to now do something about the fact that they're getting those sources. Whether it's going after TikTok, whether it's going with YouTube and all these companies functioning as basically proxies of the West by withholding certain information that they don't necessarily want to be told. How do you view censorship in this lens in regards to the propaganda model of journalism, or propaganda model of the way governments put out information?
Well, just first, the first point you raised about this indicative of the arrogance of the West, how we try to impose. Absolutely, we try to impose ourselves on other countries, and we claim it's for democratic reasons, but it's really for our own interests and so on. But it just gives us a stick to beat countries with, and so on. But the arrogance is incredible. What you see coming out of the mouths of Western politicians and European politicians, von der Leyen, at the EU and so on, is breathtaking, but in a sense not so different from what we've seen for the last 400 years from the West. I'm British by birth, obviously, and the arrogance of the British Empire. We are here to civilize you, the white man's burden and so on. You see this written on statues still for the great imperialists of the 18th, 19th century and so on, civilizing Africa, for example. That's the mindset of the West and so on which still pervades. So I agree entirely with you on that. On this issue of censorship, I mean, yes, we have social media. Governments are very aware that trust in mainstream media is flatlining, largely for extremely good reasons. Iraq, 9/11, the list goes on.
You go down the list. Yeah.
There's so many things you can point to show that the media doesn't tell you the truth. So they know that. A lot of people go to independent social media. And I think the censorship, I think you are right, that censorship is some would argue it's the bigger part of propaganda. Propaganda is a little bit about promoting things. It's mainly about shutting down some areas. And at the moment, because of social media, because of distrust in the mainstream media, they're really having to get tough on the censorship front. So you have these legislation, for example, in Europe, the Digital Services Act, which sort of integrate this fact checking and so on into the legislation. And it's essentially a way of basically filtering out and censoring people's whose opinions that people in power don't like. And they are having to do this at unprecedented levels now in the West. So we have people being prosecuted. As C.J. Hopkins, an American playwright here in Berlin, is being prosecuted for a tweet. In Germany, they're also arresting little people, members of the public, who tweet and offend a politician. And the idea is that if a politician feels that they can't do their job because somebody said something rude about them on Twitter, you can be prosecuted for that.
Oh, that's
and
outrageous.
They're doing it. Which is outrageous. So what they're trying to do is they're using legislation now. They're not just sort of using censorship in terms of trying to keep some stories out of the media. They're actually going for people in independent media who are saying things, and members of the public, and carrying out legal action against them. And they're having to do that because, I guess this gets to my main answer, because their position is weak, because they have lost the trust of so many people. Large swathes of the public. That what can we do now? It's like the Hillary Clinton example you gave. It's, let's lock them up, make it illegal, and so on. It's a sign of weakness, and that they have a certain degree of ability to manipulate the information environment via the internet because of algorithms and bots and so on. But what they can't really control is what people say to each other out on the streets and when they go to the pub or they meet friends and so on. That's a whole communications network they can't get control of. And I think they'd like to believe they can control that space through the internet and so on, and through mainstream media. But I think that's, again, they're on a hiding to nothing, but they are trying as hard as they want, as they are with the regime change wars. They're pushing as hard as they can. They're pushing as hard as they can in the Ukraine, even when they're losing that war. And they're pushing as hard as they can on controlling the information space and becoming increasingly authoritarian in doing so. Ultimately, they just diminish their credibility more and more by doing that. And they make more and more people like you, me, sort of willing to, right, well, I'll go out and I'll be independent and I'll stand my ground and speak the truth. And, however much mud you might sling at me, I'm going to stand my ground.
Are you concerned about the way AI has gotten to the point that, look, whether we were talking about the Gulf of Tonkin, whether we're talking about even the Syrian chemical weapon strikes, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, you can go down the list in regards to these kind of false flag conflicts. AI, and the ability of graphic software today is getting terrifying. And I would imagine, are you concerned that this notion of either false flags or this notion of propaganda gets worse, powered by basically fake events that can be created that effectively look real? That terrifies me in regards to the way that stuff is developing. Give me your take on it.
It's a concern because, ultimately, because AI allows fabrication, deception, obviously, and because the tool is out there, everyone can use it. But some people have got a lot of time and money and resources and have a vested interest in using it. And so, yes, it is a danger and it is a threat. I still think that people, can learn media literacy skills and just use their judgment and intelligence to think through. And this is what I always used to advise the students when you're reading mainstream media or any media. Just think critically, think for yourself, and so on. Look at other sources. So I think people still have an ability to navigate through that. Right. But you're correct. It is a threat. At the same time, some people argue that AI is potentially, because people can sort of do one of these AI searches on a particular issue, and if it is genuinely an open AI search, it actually pulls together quite a wide range of information and so on. So it can be used to the advantage of people who want to try and get a more balanced or rounded understanding of what's going on. But then, as you say, sort of the problem is there are people with resources, time, PR professionals or propagandists who might exploit it. So it is a threat, and we just have to, as with all of these things, sort of work our way through it.
What would you think was the biggest psyop that was put on the public in the most recent years? And one last question before I let you go, before I don't want to forget the question. How do people guard against it? Like if a person, I remember I was having a conversation with this woman once and I asked her, where's the floor? Like where is sometimes, because I know when I'm going through information, I'm usually doing multiple sources because I usually look at this stuff from the world's perspective. And sometimes they clash. There are certain areas where you say, okay, well, this makes sense. This makes more sense than not. But they're still sometimes very difficult to find a floor. When you're reading and you're looking through information, how do you like separate the wheat from the chaff? Is it really just I'm thinking through what I read to see whether or not this makes sense and that's the best that you got? How do you go through it for yourself?
Well, first of all, just being cautious about information that you're being given.
Mhm.
Yeah. But I think also people need to also have a broader understanding of propaganda, how media works. Herman Chomsky's propaganda model is a good sort of tool of intellectual self-defense. Understanding how propaganda is operated in previous cases, which we know about, gives you this kind of underlying ability to start to sift through information, understanding, as you were talking about, the geopolitical realities of the world.
Mhm.
Help. And then how do governments act in wartime? Well, they demonize the enemy and
Right.
they whitewash their own crimes. There's a long history of this. So understanding that history is a useful sort of underpinning for people as they start to sift through and are cautious about different sources of information and so on.
Mhm.
It's a big task, and
Yeah.
I don't know, but it's a necessary task in a democracy. So I think that those are people need to take a dual approach. One is trying to think for themselves, use their own intelligence, looking at a range of sources, but also go and read up on some history. Go and read up about the Vietnam War. Go and read up about the Iran-Contra affair in the
Oh
1980s.
man.
Look at
Yeah.
these big political issues where we've had manipulation going on. You asked me for the biggest ones, and you know, as I said at the start, 9/11 is a very major manipulation of the public mind in order to get the global war on terror going. COVID-19 also has a tremendous amount of manipulation of people's understanding going on.
Mhm.
And these are what I tend to refer to as structural deep events. This is Peter Dale Scott's idea that these are events which are instigated or manipulated by powerful groups in order to basically shape public opinion and behavior and
Mhm.
so on. And a simpler way of looking at that is crisis. Political actors know that crises are opportunities to do a lot of things. So you have the claimed threat of Al-Qaeda terrorists or the claimed threat of a deadly virus. That allows you to then do lots of other things which people aren't really aware of. And of course, we've known this since the beginning of time, that the crises are political opportunities for powerful actors. So I suppose this is the last thing I'd say is that whenever the headlines and the politicians are screaming, you've got to be scared of that and we have to do this, just think for a second. It could be that this is completely genuine and they are acting with good intentions and full knowledge, etc. Or it could be that they're taking advantage of you, they're scaring you. The whole of the war on terror, look at all the wars we've had under the cover of the global war on terror. Look at all the death and destruction underpinned by making people scared, at least initially, of terrorism, the threat of terror. That was used again and again in order to mobilize people, get people to sign up. And so I think that's, I think a big picture kind of understanding of how power and how political actors, being slightly casual here, but just love crises because it's an opportunity to do things. Always aware of that and always sort of think twice when, as I say, people are telling you to be scared. Because they might be telling you that because you don't actually have that much reason to be scared, but they just want to manipulate you. So that's a good learning point, I think, for people.
Piers, man, thank you for this. It's been such a long time since I've had you on. I really appreciate this. Thank you, Piers Robinson. He is co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies. And Piers, where can people find you today?
Well, I'm on Twitter, Piers Robinson1. I'm research director at the International Center for 9/11 Justice. We have also, I run Propaganda in Focus, which is articles published by experts and academics on propaganda. But if people go to my Twitter handle, Piers Robinson1, you'll see in the all the links to what I'm involved in, the work I do, and so on. So they can find out. Lots about propaganda, for example. My academic publications, a lot of those are public domain. So people can see the work I've done over the last 20, 25 years.
Piers Robinson, thanks again, man. I really appreciate this. Thank you for the conversation.
You too.
I'm going.